Chapter 26. Sharpshooters. Wintry morning, looking with dull eyes and sallow face upon the neighbourhood of Leicester Square, finds its inhabitants unwilling to get out of bed. Many of them are not early risers at the brightest of times, being birds of night, who roost when the sun is high, and are wide awake and keen for prey when the stars shine out. Behind dingy blind and curtain, in upper story and garret, skulking more or less under false names, false hair, false titles, false jewellery, and false histories, a colony of brigands lie in their first sleep. Gentlemen of the green baize road, who could discourse from personal experience of foreign galleys and home treadmills, spies of strong governments that eternally quake with weakness and miserable fear, broken traitors, cowards, bullies, gamesters, shufflers, swindlers, and false witnesses, some not unmarked by the branding iron beneath their dirty braid, all with more cruelty in them than was in Nero, and more crime than in Newgate. For howsoever bad the devil can be in fustian or smock frock, and he can be very bad in both, he is more designing, callous, and intolerable devil when he sticks a pin in his shirt front, calls himself a gentleman, and backs a card or colour, plays a game or so of billiards, and knows a little bit about bills and promissory notes, than in any other form he wears. And in such form Mr. Bucket shall find him when he will, still pervading the tributary channels of Leicester Square. But the wintry morning wants him not, and wakes him not. It wakes Mr. George of the shooting gallery, and his familiar. They arise, roll up, and stow away their mattresses. Mr. George, having shaved himself before a looking-glass of minute proportions, then marches out, bareheaded, bare-chested, to the pump in the little yard, and anon comes back, shining with yellow soap, friction, drifting rain, and exceedingly cold water. As he rubs himself upon a large jack-towel, blowing like a military sort of diver just come up, his hair curling tighter and tighter on his sunburnt temples the more he rubs it, so that it looks as if it could never be loosened by any less coercive instrument than an iron rake or a curry-comb. As he rubs and puffs and polishes and blows, turning his head from side to side, the more conveniently to excoriate his throat, and standing with his body well bent forward to keep the wet from his martial legs, Phil, on his knees lighting a fire, looks round as if it were enough washing for him to see all that done, and sufficient renovation for one day to take in the superfluous health his master throws off. When Mr. George is dry, he goes to work to brush his head with two hard brushes at once, to that unmerciful degree that Phil, shouldering his way around the gallery in the act of sweeping it, winks with sympathy. This chafing over the ornamental part of Mr. George's toilet is soon performed. He fills his pipe, lights it, and marches up and down smoking, as his custom is, while Phil, raising a powerful odour of hot rolls and coffee, prepares breakfast. He smokes gravely and marches in slow time. Perhaps this morning's pipe is devoted to the memory of Gridley in his grave. "And so, Phil," says George of the shooting gallery, after several turns in silence, "you were dreaming of the country last night." Phil, by the by, said as much in a tone of surprise as he scrambled out of bed. "Yes, governor." "What was it like?" "I hardly know what it was like, governor," said Phil, considering. "How did you know it was the country?" "On account of the grass, I think, and the swans upon it," says Phil, after further consideration. "What were the swans doing on the grass?" "They was eating of it, I expect," says Phil. The master resumes his march, and the man resumes his preparation of breakfast. It is not necessarily a lengthened preparation, being limited to the setting forth of a very simple breakfast requisites for two, and the broiling of a rasher of bacon at the fire in the rusty grate. But as Phil has to sidle round a considerable part of the gallery for every object he wants, and never brings two objects at once, it takes time under the circumstances. At length the breakfast is ready. Phil announcing it, Mr. George knocks the ashes out of his pipe on to the hob, stands its pipe itself in the chimney corner, and sits down to the meal. When he has helped himself, Phil follows suit, sitting at the extreme end of the little oblong table, and taking his plate on his knees, either in humility or to hide his blackened hands, or because it is his natural manner of eating. "The country," says Mr. George, plying his knife and fork. "Why, I suppose you never clapped your eyes on the country, Phil?" "I see the marshes once," says Phil, contentedly eating his breakfast. "What marshes?" "The marshes, Commander," returns Phil. "Where are they?" "Don't know where they are, master," says Phil, "but I sees 'em, governor. They was flat and misty." Governor and commander are interchangeable terms with Phil, expressive of the same respect and deference, and applicable to nobody but Mr. George. "I was born in the country, Phil." "Was you indeed, Commander?" "Yes, and bred there." Phil elevates his one eyebrow, and after respectfully staring at his master to express interest, swallows a great gulp of coffee, still staring at him. "There's not a bird's note that I don't know," says Mr. George. "Not many an English leaf or berry that I couldn't name. Not many a tree that I couldn't climb yet if I was put to it. I was a real country boy once. My good mother lived in the country." "She must have been a fine old lady, governor," Phil observes. "Ay, and not so old either. 35 years ago," says Mr. George. "But I'll wager that at 90 she would be as near as upright as me, and near as broad across the shoulders." "Did she die at 90, governor?" inquires Phil. "No, bosh! Let her rest in peace, God bless her," says the trooper. "What set me on about country boys and runaways and good for nothings? You, to be sure. So you never clapped your eyes upon the country, marshes and dreams excepted, eh?" Phil shakes his head. "Do you want to see it?" "I don't know as I do particular," says Phil. "The town's enough for you, eh?" "Well, you see, Commander," says Phil, "I ain't acquainted with anything else, and I doubt if I ain't a getting too old to take to novelties." "How old are you, Phil?" asks the trooper, pausing as he conveys his smoking saucer to his lips. "I'm something with an 8 in it," says Phil. "Can't be 80, nor yet 18. It's betwixt them somewheres." Mr. George, slowly putting down his saucer without tasting its contents, is laughingly beginning, "What a deuce, Phil," when he stops, seeing that Phil is counting on his dirty fingers. "I was just 8," says Phil, "agreeable to the parish calculation, when I went with the tinker. I was sent on an errand, and I see him a sitting under an old bullden with a fire all to himself, wery comfortable, and he says, 'Would you like to come along of me, my man?' I says, 'Yes,' and him and me and the fire goes home to Clerkenwell together. That was April Fool Day. I was able to count up to 10, and when April Fool Day came round again, I says to myself, 'Now, old chap, you're 1 and an 8 in it.' April Fool Day after that, I says, 'Now, old chap, you're 2 and an 8 in it.' In the course of time I come to 10 and an 8 in it, 2 tens and an 8 in it. When it got so high, it got the upper hand of me. But this is how I always know there's an 8 in it." "Ah," says Mr. George, resuming his breakfast, "and where's the tinker?" "Drink put him in the hospital, governor, and the hospital put in the glass case, I have heard," replies Phil mysteriously. "Well, that means you got promotion. Took the business, Phil." "Yes, Commander, I took the business, such as it was. It wasn't much of a beat. Round Saffron Hill, Hatton Garden, Clerkenwell, Smithfield, and their poor neighbourhood, where they used up the kettles till they were past mending, most of the tramping tinkers used to come and lodge at our place. That was the best part of my master's earnings, but they didn't come to me. I weren't like him. He could sing 'em a good song. I couldn't. He could play 'em a tune on any sort of pot you please, so as it was an iron and block tin. I never could do nothing with a pot but mend it or bile it. I never had a note of music in me. Besides, I was too ill looking, and their wives complained of me." "They were mighty particular. You would pass muster in a crowd, Phil," says the trooper with a pleasant smile. "No, governor," returns Phil, shaking his head. "No, I shouldn't. I was passable enough when I went with the tinker, though nothing to boast of then. But what with blowing the fire with my mouth when I was young, and spoiling my complexion, and singeing my hair off, and swallowing the smoke, and what with being naturally unfortunate in the way of running against hot metal, and marking myself by such means, and what with having turn-ups with the tinker as I got older, almost whenever he was too far gone in drink, which was almost always, my beauty was queer, very queer, even at that time. As to since, what with a dozen years in the dark forge, where the men was given to larking, and what with being scorched in an accident at a gas works, and what with being blowed out of a window case filling at the firework business, I'm ugly enough to be made a show on." Resigning himself to which condition with a perfectly satisfied manner, Phil begs the favour of another cup of coffee. While drinking it, he says, "It was after the case filling blow up when I first see you, Commander. You remember?" "I remember, Phil. You were walking along in the sun." "Crawling, governor, against the wall." "True, Phil. Shouldering your way on." "In a nightcap!" exclaims Phil, excited. "In a nightcap." "And hobbling with a couple of sticks!" cries Phil, still more excited. "With a couple of sticks, when you stops, you know," cries Phil, putting down his cup and saucer, and hastily removing his plate from his knees, "and says to me, 'What, comrade, you've been in the wars?' I didn't say much to you, Commander, then, for I was took by surprise that a person so strong and healthy and bold as you was should stop to speak to such a limping bag of bones as I was. But you says to me, says you, delivering it out of your chest as hearty as possible, so that it was like a glass of something hot, 'What accident have you met with? Have you been badly hurt? What's amiss, old boy? Cheer up and tell us all about it.' Cheer up! I was cheered already. I says as much to you. You says more to me. I says more to you. You says more to me. Here I am, Commander," cries Phil, who has started from his chair and unaccountably began to sidle away. "If a mark's wanted, or if it will improve the business, let the customers take aim at me. They can't spoil my beauty. I'm all right. Come on, if they want a man to box at, let 'em box at me. Let 'em knock me well about the head. I don't mind. If they want a lightweight to be throwed for practice, Cornwall, Devonshire, or Lancashire, let 'em throw me. They won't hurt me. I've been throwed all sorts of styles all my life." With this unexpected speech, energetically delivered, and accompanied by action illustrative of the various exercises referred to, Phil Squad's shoulders his way around three sides of the gallery, and abruptly tacking off at his commander, makes a butt at him with his head, intended to express a devotion to his service. Then he begins to clear away the breakfast. Mr. George, after laughing cheerfully and clapping him on the shoulder, assists in these arrangements and helps to get the gallery into business order. That done, he takes a turn at the dumbbells. Afterwards, weighing himself and opining that he is getting too fleshy, engages with great gravity in solitary broadsword practice. Meanwhile, Phil has fallen to work at his usual table, where he screws and unscrews and cleans and files and whistles into small apertures, and blackens himself more and more, and seems to do and undo everything that can be done and undone about a gun. Master and man are at length disturbed by footsteps in the passage, where they make an unusual sound, denoting the arrival of unusual company. These steps, advancing nearer and nearer to the gallery, bring into it a group at first sight scarcely reconcilable with any day in the year but the 5th of November. It consists of a limp and ugly figure carried in a chair by two bearers, and attended by a lean female with a face like a pinched mask, who might be expected immediately to recite the popular verses commemorative of the time when they did contrive to blow old England up alive, but for her keeping her lips tightly and defiantly closed as the chair is put down, at which point the figure in it, gasping, "Oh Lord, oh dear me, I'm shaken," adds, "How do you do, my dear friend? How do you do?" Mr. George then descries the procession, the venerable Mr. Smallweed out for an airing, attended by his granddaughter Judy as a bodyguard. "Mr. George, my dear friend," says Grandfather Smallweed, removing his right arm from the neck of one of his bearers, whom he has nearly throttled coming along, "how do you do? You surprised to see me, my dear friend?" "I should hardly have been more surprised to have seen your friend in the city," returns Mr. George. "I'm very seldom out," pants Mr. Smallweed. "I haven't been out for many months. It's inconvenient and it comes expensive. But I long so much to see you, my dear Mr. George. How do you do, sir?" "I'm well enough," says Mr. George. "I hope you're the same." "You can't be too well, my dear friend." Mr. Smallweed takes him by both hands. "I brought my granddaughter Judy. I couldn't keep her away. She longs so much to see you." She bears it calmly," mutters Mr. George. "So we got a hackney cab and put a chair in it, and just round the corner they lifted me out of the cab and into the chair, and carried me in here that I might see my dear friend in his own establishment. This," says Grandfather Smallweed, alluding to the bearer, who's been in danger of strangulation, and who withdraws, adjusting his windpipe, "is the driver of the cab. He has nothing extra. It is by agreement included in his fare. This person, the other bearer, we engaged in the street outside for a pint of beer, which is twopence. Judy, give the person twopence. I was not sure you had a workman of your own here, my dear friend, or we needn't have employed this person." Grandfather Smallweed refers to Phil with a glance of considerable terror and half subdued. "Oh Lord, oh dearie me!" Nor in his apprehension on the surface of things without some reason. For Phil, who has never beheld the apparition in the black velvet cap before, has stopped short with a gun in his hand, with much of the air of a dead shot intent on picking Mr. Smallweed off as an ugly old bird of the crow species. "Judy, my child," says Grandfather Smallweed, "give the person his twopence. It's a great deal for what he has done." The person, who was one of those extraordinary specimens of human fungus that spring up spontaneously in the western streets of London, ready dressed in an old red jacket, with a mission for holding horses and calling coaches, received his twopence with anything but transport, tosses the money into the air, catches it overhanded, and retires. "My dear Mr. George," says Grandfather Smallweed, "would you be so kind as to help to carry me to the fire? I'm accustomed to a fire. I'm an old man, and I soon chill. Oh dear me!" His closing exclamation is jerked out of the venerable gentleman by the suddenness of which Mr. Squad, like a genie, catches him up, chair and all, and deposits him on the hearthstone. "Oh Lord!" says Mr. Smallweed, panting. "Oh dearie me! Oh my stars! Oh dear friend, your workman is very strong, very prompt. Oh Lord, he is very prompt. Judy, draw me back a little. I'm being scorched in the legs," which indeed is testified to the noses of all present by the smell of his worsted stockings. The gentle Judy, having backed her grandfather a little way from the fire, and having shaken him up as usual, and having released his overshadowed eye from its black velvet extinguisher, Mr. Smallweed again says, "Oh dearie me! Oh Lord!" and looking about and meeting Mr. George's glance, again stretches out both hands. "My dear friend, so happy in this meeting, and this is your establishment. It's a delightful place. It's a picture. You never find anything that goes off here accidentally, do you, my dear friend?" adds Grandfather Smallweed, very ill at ease. "No, no, no fear of that. And your workman, oh dear me, he never lets anything off without meaning it, does he, my dear friend?" "He's never hurt anybody but himself," says Mr. George, smiling. "But he might, you know. He seems to have hurt himself a good deal, and he might hurt somebody else," the old gentleman returns. "He mightn't mean it, or he might even. Mr. George, will you order him to leave his infernal firearms alone and go away?" Obedient to a nod from the trooper, Phil retires empty-handed to the other end of the gallery. Mr. Smallweed, reassured, falls to rubbing his legs. "Are you doing well, Mr. George?" he says to the trooper, squarely standing faced about towards him with his broadsword in his hand. "You're prospering, please the powers." Mr. George answers with a cool nod, adding, "Go on, you have not come to say that, I know." "You are so sprightly, Mr. George," returns the venerable grandfather. "You are such good company." "Go on," says Mr. George. "But, my dear friend, that sword looks awful gleaming and sharp. It might cut somebody by accident. Makes me shiver, Mr. George." "Curse him," says the excellent old gentleman apart to Judy, as the trooper takes a step or two away to lay it aside. "He owes me money, and might think of paying off old scores in this murdering place. I wish your brimstone grandmother was here, and he'd shave her head off." Mr. George, returning, folds his arms, and looking down at the old man, sliding every moment lower and lower in his chair, says quietly, "Now for it." "Ho!" cries Mr. Smallweed, rubbing his hands with an artful chuckle. "Yes, now for it. Now for what, my dear friend?" "For a pipe," says Mr. George, who with great composure sets his chair in a chimney corner, takes his pipe from the grate, fills it and lights it, and falls to smoke peacefully. This tends to the discomfiture of Mr. Smallweed, who finds it so difficult to resume his object, whatever it may be, that he becomes exasperated, and secretly claws at the air with an impotent vindictiveness expressive of an intense desire to tear and rend the visage of Mr. George. As the excellent old gentleman's nails are long and leaden, and his hands lean and veinous, and his eyes green and watery, and over and above this, as he continues while he claws to slide down in his chair, and to collapse into a shapeless bundle, he becomes such a ghastly spectacle, even in the accustomed eyes of Judy, that young virgin pounces at him with something more than the ardour of affection, and so shakes him up, and pats and pokes him in divers parts of his body, but particularly in that part which the science of self-defence would call his wind, that in his grievous distress he utters enforced sounds like a paviour's rammer. When Judy has by these means set him up again in his chair, with a white face and a frosty nose, but still clawing, she stretches out her weazen forefinger and gives Mr. George one poke in the back. The trooper raising his head, she makes another poke at her esteemed grandfather, and having thus brought them together, stares rigidly at the fire. "Aye, aye, ho, ho," chatters Grandfather Smallweed, swallowing his rage. "My dear friend," still clawing. "I tell you what," says Mr. George, "if you want to converse with me, you must speak out. I'm one of the roughs, and I can't go about and about. I haven't the art to do it. I'm not clever enough. It don't suit me. When you go winding round and round me," says the trooper, putting his pipe between his lips again, "damn me if I don't feel as if I was being smothered." And he inflates his broad chest to its utmost extent, as if to assure himself that he is not smothered yet. "If you have come to give me a friendly call," continues Mr. George, "I'm obliged to you. How are you? If you come to see whether there's any property on the premises, look about you. You're welcome. If you want to out with something, out with it." The blooming Judy, without removing her gaze from the fire, gives her grandfather one ghostly poke. "You see, it's her opinion too, and why the devil the young woman won't sit down like a Christian," says Mr. George, with his eyes musingly fixed on Judy, "I can't comprehend." "She keeps at my side to attend to me, sir," says Grandfather Smallweed. "I'm an old man, my dear Mr. George, and I need some attention. I can carry my years. I'm not a brimstone poll parrot," snarling and looking unconsciously for the cushion, "but I need attention, my dear friend." "Well," returns the trooper, wheeling in his chair to face the old man, "now then." "My friend in the city, Mr. George, has done a little business with a pupil of yours." "Has he?" says Mr. George. "I'm sorry to hear it." "Yes, sir." Grandfather Smallweed rubs his legs. "He's a fine young soldier now, Mr. George, by the name of Carstone. Friends came forward and paid it all up honourable." "Did they?" returns Mr. George. "Do you think your friend in the city would like a piece of advice?" "I think he would, my dear friend, from you." "I advise him, then, to do no more business in that quarter. There's no more to be got by it. The young gentleman, to my knowledge, is brought to a dead halt." "No, no, my dear friend. No, no, Mr. George. No, 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 sir," remonstrates Grandfather Smallweed, cunningly rubbing his spare legs. "It's not quite a dead halt, I think. He has good friends, and he's good for his pay, and he's good for the selling price of his commission, and he's good for his chance in a lawsuit, and he's good for his chance in a wife. And do you know, Mr. George, I think my friend would consider the young gentleman good for something yet," says Grandfather Smallweed, turning up his velvet cap and scratching his ear like a monkey. Mr. George, who has put aside his pipe and sits with an arm on his chair back, beats a tattoo on the ground with his right foot, as if he were not particularly pleased with the turn the conversation has taken. "But to pass from one subject to another," resumes Mr. Smallweed, "to promote the conversation, as the joker might say, to pass, Mr. George, from the ensign to the captain." "What are you up to now?" asked Mr. George, pausing with a frown in stroking the recollection of his moustache. "What captain?" "Our captain, the captain we know of, Captain Hawdon." "Oh, that's it, is it?" says Mr. George, with a low whistle, as he sees both grandfather and granddaughter looking hard at him. "You are there. Well, what about it? Come, I won't be smothered any more. Speak." "My dear friend," returns the old man, "I was applied Judy, shake me up a little. I was applied to yesterday about the captain, and my opinion still is that the captain is not dead." "Bosh!" observes Mr. George. "What was your remark, my dear friend?" inquires the old man, with his hand to his ear. "Bosh!" "Oh," says Grandfather Smallweed, "Mr. George, of my opinion you can judge for yourself, according to the questions asked of me, and the reasons given for asking them. Now, what do you think the lawyer making the inquiries wants?" "A job," says Mr. George. "Nothing of the kind." "Can't be a lawyer, then," says Mr. George, folding his arms with an air of confirmed resolution. "My dear friend, he is a lawyer, and a famous one. He wants to see some fragment in Captain Hawdon's writing. He don't want to keep it, he only wants to see it and compare it with the writing in his possession." "Well?" "Well, Mr. George, happening to remember the advertisement concerning Captain Hawdon, and the information that could be given respecting him, he looked it up and came to me, just as you did, my dear friend. Will you shake hands? So glad you came that day. I should have missed forming such a friendship if you hadn't come." "Well, Mr. Smallweed," says George again, after going through the ceremony with some stiffness, "I had no such thing. I had nothing but his signature." "Plague, pestilence, famine, battle, murder, and sudden death upon him," says the old man, making a curse out of one of his few remembrances of a prayer, and squeezing up his velvet cap between his angry hands. "I have 500,000 of his signatures, I think. But you," breathlessly recovering his mildness of speech, as Judy readjusts the cap on his skittle ball of a head, "you, my dear Mr. George, are likely to have some letter or paper that would suit the purpose. Anything would suit the purpose, written in the hand." "Some writing in that hand," says the trooper, pondering. "Maybe I have." "My dearest friend, maybe I have not." "Oh," says Grandfather Smallweed, crestfallen. "But if I had bushels of it, I would not show as much as would make a cartridge without knowing why." "Sir, I have told you why, my dear Mr. George, I have told you why." "Not enough," says the trooper, shaking his head. "I must know more and approve it." "Then will you come to the lawyer, my dear friend? Will you come and see the gentleman?" urges Grandfather Smallweed, pulling out a lean old silver watch with the hands like a leg of a skeleton. "I told him it was probable I might call upon him between 10 and 11 this forenoon, and it is now half after 10. Will you come and see the gentleman, Mr. George?" He says gravely, "I don't mind that, though why this should concern you so much I don't know." "Everything concerns me that has a chance of it bringing anything to light about him. Didn't he take us all in? Didn't he owe us an immense sums all round? Concern me? Who can anything about him concern more than me?" "Not my dear friend," says Grandfather Smallweed, lowering his tone, "that I want you to betray anything. Far from it. Are you ready to come, my dear friend?" "Come in a moment. I promise nothing, you know." "No, my dear Mr. George, no." "And you mean to say you're going to give me a lift to this place, wherever it is, without charging for it?" Mr. George inquires, getting his hat and his thick wash leather gloves. The pleasantry so tickles Mr. Smallweed that he laughs long and low before the fire. But ever while he laughs he glances over at his paralytic shoulder at Mr. George, and eagerly watches him as he unlocks the padlock of a homely cupboard at the distant end of the gallery, looks here and there upon the higher shelves, and ultimately takes something out with a rustling of paper and folds it and puts it in his breast. Then Judy pokes Mr. Smallweed once, and Mr. Smallweed pokes Judy once. "I'm ready," says the trooper, coming back. "Phil, you can carry this old gentleman to his coach and make nothing of him." "Oh dear me, oh Lord, stop a moment," says Mr. Smallweed. "He's so very prompt. Are you sure you can do it carefully, my worthy man?" Phil makes no reply, but seizing the chair and its load, sidles away, tightly hugged by the now speechless Mr. Smallweed, bolts along the passage as if he had an acceptable commission to carry the old gentleman to the nearest volcano. His shorter trust, however, terminating at the cab, he deposits him there, and the fair Judy takes her place beside him, and the chair embellishes the roof, and Mr. George takes the vacant place upon the box. Mr. George is quite confounded by the spectacle he beholds from time to time as he peeps into the cab through the window behind him, where the grim Judy is always motionless, and the old gentleman with his cap over one eye is always sliding off the seat into the straw and looking upward at him out of his other eye with a helpless expression of being jolted in the back. Chapter 27. More Old Soldiers Than One. Mr. George has not far to ride with folded arms upon the box, for the destination is Lincoln's Inn Fields. When the driver stops his horses, Mr. George alights, and looking in at the window, says, "What, Mr. Tulkinghorn's your man, is he?" "Yes, my dear friend. Do you know him, Mr. George?" "I have heard of him, seen him too, I think, but I don't know him, and he don't know me." There ensues the carrying of Mr. Smallweed upstairs, which is done to perfection with the trooper's help. He is borne into Mr. Tulkinghorn's great room and deposited on the Turkey rug before the fire. Mr. Tulkinghorn is not within at the present moment, but will be back directly. The occupant of the pew in the hall, having said thus much, stirs the fire, and leaves the triumvirate to warm themselves. Mr. George is mightily curious in respect to the room. He looks up at the painted ceiling, looks round at the old law books, contemplates the portraits of the great clients, reads aloud the names on the boxes. Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, Mr. George reads thoughtfully. Ha! Manor of Chesney Wold. Mr. George stands looking at these boxes a long while, as if they were pictures, and comes back to the fire, repeating, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, and Manor of Chesney Wold, hey? Worth a hint of money, Mr. George, whispers Grandfather Smallweed, rubbing his legs. Powerfully rich. What do you mean, the old gentleman or the baronet? This gentleman. So I have heard, and knows a thing or two, I'll hold a wager. Not bad quarters either, says Mr. George, looking round again. See the strong box yonder? This reply is cut short by Mr. Tulkinghorn's arrival. There is no change in him, of course, rustily dressed, with his spectacles in his hand, and their very case worn threadbare, in manner close and dry, in voice husky and low, in face watchful behind a blind, habitually not uncensorious and contemptuous perhaps. The peerage may have warmer worshippers and faithfuler believers than Mr. Tulkinghorn after all, if everything were known. Good morning, Mr. Smallweed. Good morning, he says as he comes in. You have brought the sergeant, I see. Sit down, sergeant. Mr. Tulkinghorn takes off his gloves and puts them in his hat. He looks with half-closed eyes across the room to where the trooper stands, and says within himself, perchance, You'll do, my friend. Sit down, sergeant, he repeats as he comes to his table, which is set on one side of the fire, and takes his easy chair. Cold and raw this morning, cold and raw. Mr. Tulkinghorn warms before the bars alternately the palms and knuckles of his hands, and looks, from behind that blind which is always down, at the trio sitting in a little semicircle before him. Now I can feel what I'm about, as perhaps he can in two senses. Mr. Smallweed, the old gentleman is newly shaken up by duty to bear his part in the conversation. You have brought our good friend the sergeant, I see. Yes, sir, returns Mr. Smallweed, very servile to the lawyer's wealth and influence. And what does the sergeant say about this business? Mr. George, says Grandfather Smallweed, with a tremulous wave of his shrivelled hand, this is the gentleman, sir. Mr. George salutes the gentleman, but otherwise sits bolt upright and profoundly silent, very forward in his chair, as if the full complement of regulation appendages for a field day hung about him. Mr. Tulkinghorn proceeds. Well, George, I believe your name is George. It is so, sir. What do you say, George? I ask your pardon, sir, returns the trooper, but I should wish to know what you say. Do you mean in point of reward? I mean in point of everything, sir. This is so very trying to Mr. Smallweed's temper that he suddenly breaks out with, You're a brimstone beast, and as suddenly asks the pardon of Mr. Tulkinghorn, excusing himself for this slip of the tongue by saying to Judy, I was thinking of your grandmother, my dear. I suppose, Sergeant, Mr. Tulkinghorn resumes, as he leans on one side of his chair and crosses his legs, that Mr. Smallweed might have sufficiently explained the matter. It lies in the smallest compass, however. You served under Captain Horden at one time, and were his attendant in illness, and rendered him many little services, and were rather in his confidence, I am told. That is so, is it not? Yes, sir, that is so, says Mr. George, with military brevity. Therefore you may happen to have in your possession something, anything, no matter what, accounts, instructions, orders, a letter, anything in Captain Horden's writing. I wish to compare his writing with some that I have. If you can give me the opportunity, you shall be rewarded for your trouble. 3, 4, 5 guineas you would consider handsome, I dare say. Noble, my dear friend, cries Grandfather Smallweed, screwing up his eyes. If not, say how much more in your conscience as a soldier you can demand. There's no need for you to part with the writing against your inclination, though I should prefer to have it. Mr. George sits squared in exactly the same attitude, looks at the painted ceiling, and says never a word. The irascible Mr. Smallweed scratches the air. "The question is," says Mr. Tulkinghorn in his methodical, subdued, uninterested way, "first, whether you have any of Captain Hawdon's writing." "First, whether I have any of Captain Hawdon's writing, sir," repeats Mr. George. "Secondly, what will satisfy you for the trouble of producing it?" "Secondly, what will satisfy me for the trouble of producing it, sir," repeats Mr. George. "Thirdly, you can judge for yourself whether it is at all like that," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, suddenly handing him some sheets of written paper tied together. "Whether it is at all like that, sir. Just so," repeats Mr. George. All three repetitions Mr. George pronounces in a mechanical manner, looking straight at Mr. Tulkinghorn. Nor does he so much as glance at the affidavit in Jarndyce and Jarndyce that's been given to him for his inspection, though he still holds it in his hand, but continues to look at the lawyer with an air of troubled meditation. "Well," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, "what do you say?" "Well, sir," replies Mr. George, rising erect and looking immense, "I would rather, if you'll excuse me, have nothing to do with this." Mr. Tulkinghorn, outwardly quite undisturbed, demands, "Why not?" "Why, sir," returns the trooper, "except on military compulsion, I am not a man of business. Among civilians I am what they call in Scotland a ne'er do weel. I have no head for papers, sir. I can stand any fire better than a fire of cross questions. I mentioned to Mr. Smallweed only an hour ago, sir, when I came into things of this kind, I feel as if I was being smothered, and that is my sensation," says Mr. George, looking round upon the company, "at the present moment." With that he takes 3 strides forward to replace the papers on the lawyer's table, and 3 strides backwards to resume his former station, where he stands perfectly upright, now looking at the ground and now at the painted ceiling, with his hands behind him, as if to prevent himself from accepting any other document whatever. Under this provocation, Mr. Smallweed's favourite adjective of disparagement is so close to his tongue that he begins to say the words "my dear friend" with a monosyllable brim, thus converting the possessive pronoun into brimmy, and appearing to have an impediment in his speech. Once past this difficulty, however, he exhorts his dear friend, in the tenderest manner, not to be rash, but to do what so eminent a gentleman requires, and to do it with good grace, confident that it must be unobjectionable as well as profitable. Mr. Tulkinghorn merely utters an occasional sentence, as, "You are the best judge of your own interest, Sergeant. Take care you do no harm by this. Please yourself, please yourself. If you know what you mean, that's quite enough." These he utters with an appearance of perfect indifference as he looks over the papers on his table and prepares to write a letter. "I do assure you, sir," says Mr. George, "not to say it offensively, that between you and Mr. Smallweed here, I really am being smothered 50 times over. I really am, sir. I am not a match for you gentlemen. Will you allow me to ask why you want to see the captain's hand, in the case that I could find any specimen of it?" Mr. Tulkinghorn quietly shakes his head. "No. If you were a man of business, Sergeant, you would not need to be informed that there are confidential reasons, very harmless in themselves, for many such wants in the profession to which I belong. But if you are afraid of doing any injury to Captain Hawdon, you may set your mind at rest about that." "Aye, sir, he's dead, sir." "Is he?" Mr. Tulkinghorn quietly sits down to write. "Well, sir," says the trooper, looking into his hat after another disconcerted pause, "I am sorry not to have given you more satisfaction. If it would be any satisfaction to any one that I should be confirmed in my judgment that I would rather have nothing to do with this by a friend of mine who has a better head for business than I have, and who is an old soldier, I am willing to consult with him. I really am so completely smothered myself at the present," says Mr. George, passing his hand hopelessly across his brow, "that I don't know but what it might be a satisfaction to me." Mr. Smallweed, hearing that this authority is an old soldier, so strongly inculcates the expediency of the trooper's taking counsel with him, and particularly informing him of its being a question of 5 guineas or more, that Mr. George engages to go and see him. Mr. Tulkinghorn says nothing either way. "I'll consult my friend then, by your leave, sir," says the trooper. and I'll take the liberty of looking in again with the final answer in the course of the day. Mr. Smallweed, if you wish to be carried downstairs." "In a moment, my dear friend, in a moment. Will you first let me speak half a word with this gentleman in private?" "Certainly, sir. Don't hurry yourself on my account." The trooper retires to a distant part of the room, and resumes his curious inspection of the boxes, strong and otherwise. "If I wasn't as weak as a brimstone baby, sir," whispers Grandfather Smallweed, drawing the lawyer down to his level by the lapel of his coat, and flashing some half-quenched green fire out of his angry eyes, "I'd tear the writing away from him. He's got it buttoned up in his breast. I saw him put it there. Judy saw him put it there. Speak up, you crabbed image at the sign of a walking-stick shop, and say you saw him put it there." This vehement conjuration the old gentleman accompanies with such a thrust at his granddaughter that it is too much for his strength, and he slips way out of his chair, drawing Mr. Tulkinghorn with him until he is arrested by Judy and well shaken. "Violence will not do for me, my friend," Mr. Tulkinghorn then remarks coolly. No, I know, sir, but it's chafing and galling to the imperturbable Judy, who only looks at the fire, to know he has got what's wanted and won't give it up. He not to give it up, he, a vagabond! But never mind, sir, never mind. At the most he has only his own way for a little while. I have him periodically in a vice. I'll twist him, sir, I'll screw him, sir. If he won't do it with good grace, then I'll make him do it with bad ones, sir." "Now, my dear Mr. George," says Grandfather Smallweed, winking at the lawyer hideously as he releases him, "I'm ready for your kind assistance, my excellent friend." Mr. Tulkinghorn, with some shadowy sign of amusement manifesting itself through his self-possession, stands on the hearth-rug with his back to the fire, watching the disappearance of Mr. Smallweed, and acknowledging the trooper's parting salute with one slight nod. It is more difficult to get rid of the old gentleman, Mr. George finds, than to bear a hand in carrying him downstairs, for when he is replaced in his conveyance he is so loquacious on the subject of the guineas, and retains such an affectionate hold of his button, having in truth a secret longing to rip his coat open and rob him, that some degree of force is necessary on the trooper's part to effect a separation. It is accomplished at last, and he proceeds alone in quest of his adviser. By the Cloisterley Temple, and by Whitefriars, there, not without a glance at Hanging Sword Alley, which would seem to be something in his way, and by Blackfriars Bridge and Blackfriars Road, Mr. George sedately marches to a street of little shops lying somewhere in that ganglion of roads from Kent and Surrey, and of streets from the bridges of London, centering in the far-famed elephant who has lost his castle, formed of 1,000 four-horse coaches, into a stronger iron monster than he, ready to chop him into mincemeat any day he dares. To one of the little shops in this street, which is a musician's shop, having a few fiddles in the window, and some Pan's pipes, and a tambourine, and a triangle, and certain elongated scraps of music, Mr. George directs his massive tread. And halting at a few paces from it, as he sees a soldierly-looking woman, with her outer skirts tucked up, come forth with a small wooden tub, and in that tub commence a whisking and a splashing on the margin of the pavement, Mr. George says to himself, "She's as unusual washing greens. I never saw her except upon a baggage wagon when she wasn't washing greens." The subject of this reflection is at all events so occupied in washing greens at present that she remains unsuspicious of Mr. George's approach, until, lifting up herself and her tub together, she has poured the water off into the gutter, she finds him standing near her. Her reception of him is not flattering. "George, I never see you, but I wish you was 100 mile away." The trooper, without remarking on this welcome, follows into the musical instrument shop, where the lady places her tub of greens upon the counter, and having shaken hands with him, rests her arms upon it. "I never," she says, "George, consider Matthew Bagnet safe a minute when you're near him. You are that restless and that roving—" "Yes, I know I am, Mrs. Bagnet, I know I am." "You know you are," says Mrs. Bagnet. "What's the use of that? Why are you?" "Nature of the animal, I suppose," returns the trooper good humouredly. "Ah," cries Mrs. Bagnet, something shrilly, "what satisfaction will the nature of the animal be to me when the animal shall have tempted my mat away from the musical business to New Zealand or Australia?" Mrs. Bagnet is not at all an ill-looking woman, rather large boned, a little coarse in the grain, and freckled by the sun and wind which have tanned her hair upon the forehead, but healthy, wholesome, and bright-eyed, a strong, busy, active, honest-faced woman, of whom from 45 to 50, hardy, and so economically dressed, though substantially, that the only article of ornament of which she stands possessed appears to be her wedding ring, around which her finger has grown to be so large since it was put on that it will never come off again until it shall mingle with Mrs. Bagnet's dust. "Mrs. Bagnet," says the trooper, "I'm on my parole with you, and that will get no harm from me. You may trust me so far." "Well, I think I may, but the very looks of you are unsettling," Mrs. Bagnet rejoins. "Ah, George, George, if you had only settled down and married Joe Pouch's widow when he died in North America, she'd have combed your hair for you." "It was a chance for me, certainly," returns the trooper, half laughingly, half seriously, "but I shall never settle down into a respectable man now. Joe Pouch's widow might have done me good. There was something in her and something of her, but I couldn't make up my mind to do it. If I had had the luck to meet such a wife as Matt found." Mrs. Bagnet, who seems in a virtuous way to be under a little reserve with a good sort of fellow, but to be another good sort of fellow herself for that matter, receives this compliment by flicking Mr. George in the face with a head of greens and taking her tub into the little room behind the shop. "Why, Quebec, my poppet," says George, following on invitation into that department, "and little Malta too. Come and kiss your Bluffy." These young ladies, not supposed to have been actually christened by the names applied to them, though always so called in the family from the places of their birth in barracks, are respectively employed on the three-legged stools. The younger, some 5 or 6 years old, in learning her letters out of a penny primer; the elder, 8 or 9 perhaps, in teaching her and sewing with great assiduity. Both hail Mr. George with acclamations as an old friend. After some kissing and romping, plant their stools beside him. "And how's young Woolwich?" says Mr. George. "Ah, there now," cries Mrs. Bagnet, turning about from her saucepans, for she is cooking dinner, with a bright flush on her face. "Would you believe it? Got an engagement at the theatre with his father to play the fife in a military piece." "Well done, my godson," cries Mr. George, slapping his thigh. "I believe you," says Mrs. Bagnet. "He's a Briton, that's what Woolwich is, a Briton. And Matt blows away at his bassoon. And you're respectable civilians, one and all," says Mr. George. "Family people, children growing up. Matt's old mother in Scotland, and your old father somewhere else. Corresponded with, and helped a little. And well, to be sure, I don't know why I shouldn't be wished 100 mile away, for I've not much to do with all of this." Mr. George is becoming thoughtful, sitting before the fire in the whitewashed room, which has a sanded floor and a barrack smell, and contains nothing superfluous, and has not a visible speck of dust upon it. From the faces of Quebec and Malta to the bright tin pots and pannikins upon the dresser shelves, Mr. George is becoming thoughtful, sitting here while Mrs. Bagnet is busy, when Mr. Bagnet and young Woolwich opportunely come home. Mr. Bagnet is an ex-artillery man, tall and upright, with shaggy eyebrows and whiskers like the fibres of a cocoanut, not a hair upon his head, and a torrid complexion. His voice, short, deep, and resonant, is not at all unlike the tones of the instrument to which he is devoted. Indeed, there may be generally observed in him an unbending, unyielding, brass-bound air, as if he were himself the bassoon of the human orchestra. Young Woolwich is the type and model of a young drummer. Both father and son salute the trooper heartily, he saying in due season that he has come to advise with Mr. Bagnet. Mr. Bagnet's hospitality declares that he will hear of no business until after dinner, and that his friend shall not partake of his counsel without first partaking of boiled pork and greens. The trooper yielding to this invitation, he and Mr. Bagnet, not to embarrass the domestic preparations, go forth to take a turn up and down the little street, which they promenade with measured tread and folded arms, as if it were a rampart. George, says Mr. Bagnet, you know me. It's my old girl that advises. She has the head, but I never own to it before her. Discipline must be maintained. Wait till the greens is off her mind, then we'll consult. Whatever the old girl says, do it. I intend to, Matt, replies the other. I would sooner take her opinion than that of a college. College, returns Mr. Bagnet in short sentences, bassoon like. What college could you leave? In another quarter of the world, with nothing but a grey cloak and an umbrella, to make its way home to Europe. The old girl would do it tomorrow. Did it once. You are right, says Mr. George. What college, pursues Bagnet, could you set up in life, with 2 pennyworth of white lime, pennyworth of fuller's earth, a ha'porth of sand, and the rest of the change out of sixpence in money? That's what the old girl started on, in the present business. I'm rejoiced to hear it's thriving, Matt. The old girl, says Mr. Bagnet, acquiescing, saves, has a stocking somewhere with money in it. I never saw it, but I know she's got it. Wait till the greens is off her mind, then she'll set you up. She is a treasure, exclaims Mr. George. She's more, but I never owned to it before her. Discipline must be maintained. It was the old girl that brought out my musical abilities. I should have been in the artillery now, but for the old girl. 6 years I hammered at the fiddle, 10 at the flute. The old girl said it wouldn't do. Intention good, but want of flexibility. Try the bassoon. The old girl borrowed a bassoon from the bandmaster of the rifle regiment. I practised in the trenches, got on, got another, get a living by it. George remarks that she looks as fresh as a rose and as sound as an apple. The old girl, says Mr. Bagnet in reply, is a thoroughly fine woman. Consequently, she is like a thoroughly fine day, gets finer as she gets on. I never saw the old girl's equal, but I never owned to it before her. Discipline must be maintained. Proceeding to converse on indifferent matters, they walk up and down the little street, keeping step and time, until summoned by Quebec and Malta to do justice to the pork and greens, over which Mrs. Bagnet, like a military chaplain, says a short grace. In the distribution of these comestibles, as in every other household duty, Mrs. Bagnet develops an exact system of sitting with every dish before her, allotting to every portion of pork its own portion of pot liquor, greens, potatoes, and even mustard, and serving it out complete, having likewise served out the beer from a can, and thus supplied the mess with all things necessary. Mrs. Bagnet proceeds to satisfy her own hunger, which is in a healthy state. The kit of the mess, if the table furniture may be so denominated, is chiefly composed of utensils of horn and tin that have done duty in several parts of the world. Young Woolwich's knife in particular, which is of the oyster kind, with the additional feature of a strong shutting up movement, which frequently balks at the appetite of that young musician, is mentioned as having gone in various hands the complete round of foreign service. The dinner done, Mrs. Bagnet, assisted by the younger branches, who polish their own cups and platters and knives and forks, makes all the dinner garniture shine as brightly as before, and puts it all away, first sweeping the hearth, to the end that Mr. Bagnet and the visitor may not be retarded in the smoking of their pipes. These household cares involve much pattening, counter-pattening in the backyard, and considerable use of a pail, which is finally so happy as to assist in the ablutions of Mrs. Bagnet herself, that old girl reappearing by and by, quite fresh, and sitting down to her needlework. Then, and only then, the greens being only then to be considered as entirely off her mind, Mr. Bagnet requests the trooper to state his case. This Mr. George does with great discretion, appearing to address himself to Mr. Bagnet, but having an eye solely on the old girl all the time. As Bagnet has himself, she, equally discreet, busies herself with her needlework. The case fully stated, Mr. Bagnet resorts to his standard artifice in the maintenance of discipline. "That's the whole of it, is it, George?" says he. "That's the whole of it." "You act according to my opinion?" "I shall be guided," replies George, "entirely by it." "Old girl," says Mr. Bagnet, "give him my opinion. You know it. Tell him what it is." "It is that he cannot have too little to do with people who are too deep for him, and cannot be too careful of interference with matters he does not understand. That the plain rule is to do nothing in the dark, to be a party to nothing underhanded, or mysterious, and never to put his foot where he cannot see the ground. This, in effect, is Mr. Bagnet's opinion, as delivered through the old girl. So it relieves Mr. George's mind by confirming his own opinion, and banishing his doubts that he composes himself to smoke another pipe on that exceptional occasion, and to have a talk over old times with the whole Bagnet family, according to their various ranges of experience. Through these means it comes to pass that Mr. George does not again rise to his full height in that parlour until the time is drawing on when the bassoon and fife are expected by a British public at the theatre, and as it takes time even then for Mr. George, in his domestic character of Bluffy, to take leave of Quebec and Malta, and insinuate a sponsorial shilling into the pocket of his godson, with felicitations on his success in life, it is dark when Mr. George again turns his face towards Lincoln's Inn Fields. A family home, he ruminates as he marches along, however small it is, makes a man like me look lonely. But it's well I never made that evolution of matrimony. I shouldn't have been fit for it. I'm such a vagabond still, even at my present time of life, that I couldn't hold to the gallery a month together, if it was a regular pursuit, or if I didn't camp there gypsy fashion. Come, I'll disgrace nobody, encumber nobody. That's something. I have not done that for many a long year. So he whistles it off and marches on. Arrived in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and mounting Mr. Tulkinghorn's stair, he finds the outer door closed and the chambers shut. But the trooper, not knowing much about outer doors, and the staircase being dark besides, he is yet fumbling and groping about, hoping to discover a bell handle or to open the door for himself, and Mr. Tulkinghorn comes up the stairs, quietly of course, and angrily asks, "Who is that? What are you doing there?" "I ask your pardon, sir, it's George the sergeant." "And couldn't George the sergeant see that my door was locked?" "Why, no, sir, I couldn't. At any rate, I didn't," says the trooper, rather nettled. "Have you changed your mind, or are you in the same mind?" Mr. Tulkinghorn demands, but he knows well enough at a glance. "In the same mind, sir." "I thought so. That's sufficient. You can go." "So you are the man," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, opening his door with the key, "in whose hiding place Mr. Gridley was found?" "Yes, I am the man," says the trooper, stopping 2 or 3 stairs down. "What then, sir?" "What then? I don't like your associates. You should not have seen the inside of my door this morning if I had thought of your being that man. Gridley, a threatening, murderous, dangerous fellow." With these words spoken in an unusually high tone for him, the lawyer goes into his rooms and shuts the door with a thundering noise. Mr. George takes his dismissal in great dudgeon, the greater because a clerk, coming up the stairs, has heard the last words of all, and evidently applies them to him. "A pretty character to bear," the trooper growls with a hasty oath as he strides downstairs. "A threatening, murderous, dangerous fellow." And looking up, he sees the clerk looking down at him, and marking him as he passes a lamp. This so intensifies his dudgeon that for 5 minutes he is in an ill humour, but he whistles that off like the rest of it, and marches home to the shooting gallery.